would like to acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10 territories, the traveling route, gathering place, and meeting grounds for Indigenous peoples whose histories, languages, cultures, and traditions continue to influence our vibrant community. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. My name is Dixie, and I'd like to share with you a brief overview of our presentation. We will discuss the effects of racial segregation, a brief history of racism, racial blind spots, critical race theory, intersectionality, ally versus accomplice, and questions. And just a quick disclaimer, our presentation might encourage you to challenge your identity. It also contains strong language which may be offensive to some audiences and may be inappropriate for children. Now we ask that you stop and ponder which of these dolls looks like you. The doll test is a psychological experiment that was designed by Kenneth and Mamie Clark in the 1940s to test the effects of prejudice, discrimination, and racial segregation on African American children. We now invite you to enjoy a 2015 recreation of the doll test.
Quale è cattiva? Quale è buona?
Lei,
Perché è buona?
perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più?
According to Sensoy and D'Angelo, ancient societies did not divide people into racial categories. When the United States was formed, their economy relied on the enslavement of African peoples and the displacement and genocide of indigenous peoples. These social and political interests shaped race science. Thomas Jefferson enlisted scientists to uncover genetic differences between races. They ended up, quote unquote, proving a so-called natural race hierarchy with the measurement of skulls, and used this information to perpetuate the idea that white people are more intelligent. We have another question for you. Do you have a racism blind spot? A racism blind spot is when our unconscious mind naturally categorizes and makes assumptions. It creates blind spots, unconscious biases that narrow our vision and potentially influence our behaviors. It is now time for the interactive component of our presentation. I encourage you to pause the video and take part in part 1 and part 2 of this interaction. On your left-hand side is the QR code that you should follow to take this Harvard Implicit Association test to check your blind spot. And on the right-hand side is part 2, recording those results in an online survey. And even though the IAT test requires an aggregate of results for accuracy, we still believe this experience will be valuable.
When we talk about racism, it's important to understand a concept called critical race theory. This framework was developed in the 80s by legal scholars and helps us understand how structural racial disparities oppress minorities and how our laws and policies continue to apply the oppression today. It condemns the idea that racism is a normal part of society and makes us think about racism as systemic, not individual. It draws our attention to how laws and social structures that are supposed to be neutral can actually support racial disparities. Areas where we can see systematic racism built into the context of society include the distribution of wealth, data around incarceration, it's reflected in our representation of our leaders, and it's evident in education. Some might question whether systemic racism exists in present-day society. So let's take a look at some examples where racial disparity has been part of the foundational elements of our country, as well as its current representations. Indigenous people have lived on North America for thousands of years, yet the British believed that they could come claim the land as their own and its inhabitants as their subjects because of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is a document where European colonizers believed they had God-given rights to inhabit and claim ownership of other lands. It held the idea that European people, culture, and religion was superior to all others, and so they could impose colonial laws on indigenous people. After colonization, indigenous people were segregated to reserves, which still exist today. The reserves were usually far away from prime land and hunting areas, and they did unfairly benefit European settlers. Indigenous people were required to have permission in order to leave a reserve. And although they were expected to farm it, they were not permitted to use the same tools as white people, nor were they permitted to sell their produce. The land could also be expropriated at any time, a concept that continues to be reaffirmed in the 2014 Supreme Court ruling between the Tsilhqot'in and British Columbia. Other issues we're familiar with today would be residential school, the 60s scoop, the continuous battle for safe drinking water. These are all present-era examples of disparity. The Indian Act is another example. It's a piece of federal policy that has authority over a specific people group. And it has some really disturbing articles. From 1927, for example, it says the government will decide where an individual person can seek entertainment, and they specifically reference pool halls. But in the most recent revision of the Indian Act in 1985, the policy is still there. Regarding health care, a 5-year-old by the name of Jordan died in hospital while waiting for the provincial and federal governments to agree on who would financially be responsible for his care. Because of that, the Jordan's principle came into existence. It ensures that a child's well-being will never be disregarded due to levels of avoiding responsibility on behalf of the government. However, as the previous slides explained, critical race theory aims to draw attention to the fact that some policy that is intended to be neutral or bring equality can actually be harmful. And in this case, we can see that in order to qualify for Jordan's principal assistance, a child must be registered under the Indian Act, have a parent who is registered, must be recognized by their nation, and ordinarily live on a reserve. So, unfortunately, due to expatriation efforts, there are a number of Indigenous people who don't have status today and are therefore ineligible to receive this support. And it's not a standalone circumstance. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found the federal government guilty of discrimination against Indigenous children. They were found to have committed more than 90 violations and were ordered to pay $30 million. The government did announce that they were going to pay that money, but what they didn't say is that they fought it, they're being forced to pay it, and in fact, they were appealing it. When we look at kids in care, 90% of kids in government care in Manitoba are Indigenous. Out of the 50 childhood deaths that occurred in 2022 in Alberta while they were in government care, 82% of those kids were Indigenous. When we look at incarceration, 28% of incarcerated people are Indigenous, 40% if we're talking about women. But Indigenous people only make up 4% of the population. So these are some examples of how institutional racism continues to be woven into the fabric of our society today. And I really want to be clear, I hope you find this appalling. An important part of critical race theory is valuing narratives. It's listening to the experiences of people who have felt oppression or been impacted by it. As educators, one of the best ways we can incorporate anti-racism is to practice reading, listening to, and affirming these stories and experiences. Because listening is multifaceted, there's lots of ways to engage students, from videos to picture books to novels to art exhibits or inviting guests to come and speak to your kids. You can learn about making meaning from those stories by reflecting on the past, looking forward, and even reflecting inward and allowing these stories to affect us. Now, because this has been a heavy topic, I want to show you a 2-minute clip before moving to the next section. It's comedic, but I really hope it will also make you think.
Hello. Hello. First, I'd like to remind everyone here to turn off your cell phones. Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theater stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Sorry, hello? Sorry, excuse me, should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh, no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't shouldn't we do something about that? Or
Hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
oh, okay, so some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
A portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water, or?
Oh no, that money goes to Nestle.
Nestle.
They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry. I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
I don't understand.
I'm getting a message from the stage manager that we need to begin the show, so please take your seats.
But,
Have a good time.
but
Good night.
guess I'll sit down. Enjoy the show. Just enjoy the show.
Next, we move into intersectionality. It's a concept that emerged from the African American perspective of the feminist struggle. The feminist struggle served white middle-class women. We simultaneously occupy both oppressed and privileged positions, and these positions intersect in complex ways. Facing oppression in one area of social life does not cancel out your privilege in another. Your unique identities will be more or less important in different situations. We need a nuanced understanding of diverse experiences. Intersectionality is about how different identities intersect, interlock, and compete to provide and produce different outcomes of power, behavior, and the distribution of resources in different circumstances in our social world. We need to recognize the multiple dimensions of difference which interweave and intersect to provide a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of oppression. There's evidence to indicate that the weight of these categories is imbalanced and that gender as an inequality has taken precedence over race. I would like to encourage you to take a moment and examine where your identities are in relation to this wheel of power and privilege. I personally have 7 in the inner power circle, 4 in the middle power circle, and 1 in the outer. Education continues to be dominated by white privilege. It dominates the construction of knowledge and the lens that knowledge is communicated through. I've included here a social identity wheel lesson plan. I will include the QR code for this lesson plan directly in our handout for your future reference. I really like this social identity wheel lesson as the children have to sort of rate in this circle the identities they think most often about, least often about, the ones they want to learn more about, the ones that have the strongest effect on how they see themselves, and the ones that have the strongest effect on how others see them. I think it leaves a lot of room for nuance and really introduces the concept of intersectionality to the students. I hope you find this resource useful.
Hi, I am Athena. Now that we understand more about racism and intersectionality, and before we can consider what it means to bring anti-racist education into the classroom, we need to understand the differences between an ally and an accomplice. Indigenous action takes a firm stance on the differences between the two. According to Indigenous action, allies are often self-proclaimed helpers with little input from the marginalized groups. Allies and their organizations tend to run on a savior versus victim binary that fosters codependency. Allies use guilt and shame as motivators and show up when it is convenient for them, often taking control. In contrast, accomplices seek to attack racism from an institutional level. They operate with a we mentality rather than an us versus them. Accomplices listen more than they speak and are partners in crime to the marginalized communities. Packnet sums up the differences when she states that an ally shows up when it is convenient, an accomplice shows up when there is a risk. To illustrate some examples, let's consider which category missionary work falls into, ally or accomplice. Well, according to Indigenous action, these are the ally saviors who see victims and tokens instead of people. They consider this to be a form of self-help therapy prompted by guilt. Now consider grassroots and nonprofit establishments. Are they allies or accomplices? According to Indigenous action, they set the terms of engagement or dictate what struggles get amplified or marginalized irregardless of whose homelands they are operating on. They consider the actions of these organizations to, in most cases, perpetuate the colonial organization that they claim to resist. Now consider this scenario. Speaking up to an employer or your human resources department to demand change in racist hiring practices, not based on an individual scenario, but to encourage a change in the entire system. You may risk losing your job or your social status among employers and peers, but you do it anyway, either under the guidance of a minoritized group or with their explicit advice. Indigenous action would consider this as that of an accomplice, stating that accomplices aren't afraid to engage in uncomfortable, unsettling, challenging debates or discussions. Overall, it is important to think outside of the individual incidents you observe and consider the big systemic picture when pushing for change. So, where do we start? And how does this apply to education? Well, Roy 2018 suggests that to be a critical race teacher activist, we must become accomplices inside the classrooms. In her guide to white teachers, she asserts that to start, you must check yourself, and this involves several steps. First, educate yourself. Learn about topics and history from multiple perspectives and be ready and willing to constantly take in and learn new information and perspectives. Understand your privilege. Even if you are not explicitly racist, you may still be part of the dominant culture, and as such, you have privilege. Critique the system, not the movement. Rather than making judgments on the type of protests marginalized groups perform, consider the background behind why that community expresses themselves in that way. Listen and believe. If you are white, you cannot deny the impact and reach of racism on peoples of color. Defer to the community. Be mindful when taking leadership roles. Amplify the narratives of marginalized groups rather than taking them over. Don't always take white privilege personally, but don't ignore it. We are all oppressed in ways, but consider the intersections of this oppression and the ways in which the system benefits white people regardless of other marginalized groups they might belong to. Beware of how your contributions are or are not recognized. Do not take the credit for change. Instead, find ways to recognize peoples of color for their contributions. Once you have checked yourself, Roy suggests you check your people. By this, she is referring to white people checking other white people. First, she suggests white people speak up. Speak up to racist jokes, remarks, and hiring practices. Focus on institutional change whenever possible. Focus on fixing the system, not the children and families of color. Educate others to disrupt and recognize how power works. Play the race card. A common accusation against peoples of color when they speak out against injustice. Make sure that you are speaking out too. And finally, create accomplice networks that focus on taking action through institutional and systemic change. As Francesca Ramsey states, from the perspective of a Black person, we need your help building this house, but you probably should listen so you know what to do first. So, to finish our discussion of allies and accomplices, consider this question. As pre-service teachers, what do you feel the answer is?
These thought-provoking questions will be posted for discussion.